And we are first going to talk about just cellular respiration in general. I know we've already mentioned this. There's a couple things that I want to clear up that common misconceptions. And I think we actually talked about them before as well, but never hurts to repeat it so that they are not misconceptions in your brains anymore. First of all, the number one misconception is that cellular respiration only uses sugar, right? So people are like, oh, you eat sugar so that you can metabolize it into energy. Well, that's true, but also all kinds of other things get metabolized by cellular respiration as well. So you can use fats, you can use amino acids, you can use all kinds of sugars, polysaccharides, monosaccharides, disaccharides, whatever, right? All these things can really be broken down in the process of cellular respiration to get energy, okay? So we can say that this is using sugars and other macromolecules to produce ATP. Okay? And another big misconception that people have is that plants get their energy from photosynthesis alone. And we said that when we did photosynthesis, all of the ATP that gets created in the light reactions is used in the Calvin cycle. There's no extra ATP there. So if a plant needs ATP for other processes in the cell, which they do, right, they're going to have to get that energy from cellular respiration. So we say that plants use cellular respiration to provide ATP to cellular processes. Okay, so we alluded to this earlier when we did the quiz. There was a quiz question that said something to the effect of like, where would you be least likely to find photosynthesis taking place? The answer was the roots, right? Because roots are generally not green in color; they're generally white in color, and so roots are made out of cells, and cells require energy. So then, where are those cells getting the energy from? From cellular respiration. Specifically, the plant is transporting sugars down to the roots, so that the roots can go through cellular respiration so that they can get ATP, right? Okay, so let's talk about the two types of cellular respiration. There's a type called aerobic respiration, and you've probably heard that term before. If you haven't heard of aerobic respiration, you should have at least heard of the term aerobics, right? There's such a thing as called aerobic exercise. Anybody know what aerobic exercise does for you? Why you would want to do aerobic exercises?
Bless you.
What does it do?
Doesn't it strengthen your heart and blood flow pumping? You're more efficient.
Yeah, it makes you more efficient. So the idea behind aerobic respiration, or aerobic exercise rather, is you want to strengthen two parts of your body. You want to strengthen first your heart and your cardiovascular system, right? You want to make it sure that every time your heart pumps, it pumps a lot of blood around. Right? And number two, you want to make sure that your lungs are exchanging gases at a very efficient rate. So there's two parts to that. First of all, how much are you breathing in and breathing out? Right? So somebody who's out of shape, they've got a very low difference, what's called their tidal volume, or how much they're breathing in and breathing out at any given time, because they don't move their diaphragm too much. But somebody who's in really good shape is moving most of the air in and out of their lungs in any given breath. Right? And so that's allowing for more gas exchange that way, and then also the efficiency of the gas exchange between your blood and the air that's in your lungs is involved in that as well. That was a long aside to this. The whole point of aerobic respiration is that you need oxygen to go through aerobic respiration. It's required, and the reason why it's required is because it's something called the terminal electron acceptor. So we'll say this is respiration using O2 as the terminal electron acceptor. Okay, terminal electron acceptor. So that word terminal electron acceptor, it means exactly what it sounds like, and that is that it's the final thing that the electrons will go to. So the electrons are going to pass through a whole bunch of other molecules, intermediate compounds and stuff, and then the final thing that they'll go into is the oxygen, and then that'll turn it into water, and then those electrons are now in their lowest energy state. Okay? So there's 3 steps to aerobic respiration. Step 1 is called glycolysis, which is the initial breakdown of sugar, which is what we're going to focus most on today. Number 2, though, is called the prep steps or the preparatory steps. And it's sometimes also just called the formation of acetyl coenzyme A or acetyl-CoA. Then you've got step 3, which is called the Krebs cycle. Okay, and the Krebs cycle is sometimes called the citric acid cycle. And then number 4, you've got the most important part, which is the electron transport chain. Okay? Or ETC. And if all these things go correctly, if all these things go well, the end product of this will be between 36 and 38 ATP. And we'll talk later about why there's a variation there. But that's what we want to get out of this, is around 36 to 38 ATP total. Okay? These steps here, 2, 3, and 4, these require O2. You cannot do them if you don't have oxygen. Okay, so if you don't have O2, you're stuck with just doing glycolysis. And that's not the end of the world. Glycolysis is the oldest metabolic process. We know this because it's the thing that the most organisms have in common. And so we can say, like, okay, well, if it's the most things that if most organisms have it in common, it had to have evolved first, right? And it can be involved also in something that is called anaerobic respiration. And something about this that might be useful, just as a vocabulary lesson. Whoa. If you ever see the letter A in front of a word, and you know that word normally, that generally means not. Okay, so in the case of like biotic organisms are living organisms. And if you're talking about abiotic, that would mean non-living things, right? So in the case of aerobic respiration, if you added an A in front of it, it would be aerobic respiration, right? And so that would be difficult to differentiate. And so they put an N there, right, to make it easier to figure out that that means not, right? So anaerobic means not aerobic respiration, in which case we're talking about respiration without O2. Without. O2. And it's super inefficient compared to aerobic respiration. In anaerobic, there's only 2 stages. Stage 1 is glycolysis, just like before, but with a slight change, because at the end of glycolysis, it's going to end with the reduction of pyruvate using NADH. And don't worry about what that means yet. It'll mean a lot more in just a minute. Okay? So reduction of pyruvate using NADH. Okay? So let's look at glycolysis then. We can think of glycolysis as the initial breakdown of sugar. And specifically, it's going to work the best with glucose. Okay, so even though I said that lots of other molecules can go through cellular respiration, glycolysis pretty much requires glucose. So if you've got some other type of sugar, it's got to be broken down or modified at least so that it can go in there as glucose, right? A lot of organisms are able to metabolize other sugars, like lactose or something like that. Right? And the way that they can metabolize them is just breaking them down and turning them into glucose monomers. Okay? So, this starts with glucose. We'll do our inputs in red here. Glucose, that's our input. Okay? And glucose is going to get broken down into 2 3-carbon chains. Okay? And if you spent the time to learn the molecules in Calvin cycle, you're going to be really happy because these are exactly the same. Okay? So, glucose gets broken down. And in order to break it down, it's got to be changed into a less stable molecule first, and it's got to be phosphorylated twice. So we're going to use 2 ATP. And you might be confused here because you're like, wait a second, I thought the whole point of cellular respiration was to make ATP, and you're telling me the first thing we have to do is use ATP? Yeah, it's sort of like one of those, like, you got to spend money to make money kind of things. You got to spend ATP to make ATP. So, you phosphorylate it twice, it becomes a molecule that's called fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Fructose 1,6-bisphosphate gets broken down into a molecule that is called G3P. So that should seem familiar. Right? G3P is the end product of the Calvin cycle. Then the G3P gets broken down. 2 high-energy electrons are pulled away from it. And when the 2 high-energy electrons are pulled away, you can use a molecule that is called NAD. Whoopsies. NAD+. And you're going to create a molecule called NADH, right? By adding in those high-energy electrons. Right? So NAD+ becomes NADH. Okay? When you do that, you've taken 2 high-energy electrons away, and you get a molecule that is called BPG, which you should recognize. It's the exact same molecule that is an intermediate step in the Calvin cycle. Okay? And then BPG has an extra phosphate group on it, and so you can take an ADP, and you can create ATP. Okay, so now you've removed a phosphate group from it. When you remove a phosphate group from BPG, it becomes 3PGA. And when you do that, now it's got one more phosphate group that you can pull off, because it's phosphoglyceric acid. And so you can take ADP rather, and you can create ATP. Okay, and then finally you're left with a molecule that has a lot of energy left, but we've used a lot of the energy, and that's called pyruvate. Pyruvate. Okay, so inputs here. Our inputs are glucose, 1 glucose, 2 ATP. Okay. You also need to account for these 4 ADPs and then 2 NAD pluses. Okay, and then our outputs, we've got glucose, or sorry, pyruvate, because we use the molecule glucose to create these lower energy pyruvates. We spent these two ATPs, and so those turned into ADPs. We turned these 4 ADPs into 4 ATPs. Right? And then our NADHs got turned into, or NAD pluses got turned into NADHs. Right? So net here, from the ATP standpoint, we net 2 ATP. Okay, and that's the only place that ATP is going to come from in this process. So up here, we said that aerobic respiration would make 36 to 38 ATP, right? But this only goes through glycolysis, and how much does glycolysis make? 2. 2 ATP total. That's pretty inefficient compared, right? This makes 36 to 38 per glucose. This makes 2 per glucose. All right. So these things, the NADH and the pyruvate, where does the NADH get used? You got high energy electrons. If you had to guess where high energy electrons are important of all these steps, where would you guess? Electron transport chain, that makes sense, right? You're going to use high energy electrons in the electron transport chain. So this is going to go to the ETC. When the pyruvate is going to be used in the prep steps. Okay? Questions so far? All right, so let's talk about anaerobic modifications. And this is sometimes called fermentation. So the first thing that I want you to do, I'm going to freeze my screen, and I want you to just see if you can remember the steps. So we're going to, it's exactly the same as what we just did. Okay, so you're starting with glucose. See if you can remember the steps. I will unpause, but I want you to see if you can try. Alright, so it should have something that looks like this. I simplified, I didn't write my ADPs going in because they're not really super important here. But I did still write the NAD plus and the NADH. And the reason for that is that I want you to notice the difference between anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic glycolysis. And that is that when you get to the end, we said that the NADH would be used in the electron transport chain, and we said the pyruvate would be used in the prep steps, right? But if you look at anaerobic versus aerobic, Is there an electron transport chain or prep steps in anaerobic respiration? No. So you're left with these two other things left over, the NADH and the pyruvate, right? And they're just waste products, okay? And there's one thing that you need to understand about that, and that is it's fine if you have NADH as a waste product. It's fine if you have pyruvate as a waste product. But every time you make an NADH, you use an NAD+. Okay? So if you keep making NADHs and you never use them, you're going to run out of NAD+. And if you run out of NAD+, then you won't be able to go past this part of glycolysis, which means you'll never be able to make any ATP. Right? Which is bad. And we all agree that's bad. All right, so what's going to happen then is these NADHs are going to go and they are going to combine with the pyruvate. Okay, and when they combine with pyruvate, that's that last step that I said for anaerobic respiration, where you have the reduction of pyruvate using NADH, and it produces either lactic acid or alcohol. Okay, and by doing that, you then create a very important molecule, which is NAD+.
The whole point of like pyruvate being there is so that NADH can be there.
Yep, in this step, yes. In anaerobic respiration, rather, pyruvate's going to get broken down a bunch more, and it's going to be good that it does that because it's going to get a lot more energy out of it. But in anaerobic respiration, there's no other stages that it can go through, so it just has to get rid of that pyruvate, and it creates lactic acid or alcohol in order to do that. Now, anytime you've ever been out and you quote unquote feel the burn, you're exercising a whole bunch to the point where you feel the burn, you are feeling the actual burn of lactic acid buildup because whatever exercise you're doing is something that you are not aerobically fit enough to do. Okay, so your muscles are still able to work. You're strong enough to keep running, but you are not supplying your muscles with the amount of oxygen that they need. And so instead of going through this, which is aerobic respiration where you're creating 36 to 38 ATP, you instead go through lactic acid fermentation, which is this, and all this lactic acid starts building up in your muscles, and it's actually burning them. It feels bad because they're getting burnt. They're getting hurt by the lactic acid. Okay? That's why your muscles are sore the next day, because of all this lactic acid that's building up. Okay? If you've ever been let's say you go and work out, and then you go and you're back at home and you're not working out anymore, but you're still out of breath. You're like laying on the ground and you feel like you still can't catch your breath. The reason for that is you've created so much lactic acid in your body that your body is working overtime to oxygenate all of those areas that have lactic acid in them, because the lactic acid has to be converted back into pyruvate so that it can go back through the rest of the steps. A lot of times when people see this, they say, oh, well, I think I want to go through fermentation here because it's burning more glucose and I'm just running to burn calories, right? And I'm only creating 2 ATP per glucose then. Well, it doesn't really work like that, because at the end you've created something called an oxygen debt because you've got all this lactic acid around, and it still has to be converted back into pyruvate and then metabolized away like normal, but it just isn't happening right then. What's up?
So if you didn't have that process, like if your body just didn't go through it, would you be perfectly fine?
You would die.
No, I mean like the anaerobic, like you went through the aerobic.
You would die.
Why?
Because you'd run out of ATP. The only reason your body does this is because it still is requiring ATP, but you don't have enough oxygen for it. And so if you couldn't go through this, you'd be like, hey, I need ATP. And then they're like, sorry, we don't have oxygen. And they're like, okay, guess no cellular processes are going on. Guess your brain stops functioning, and then you die. So it's good that this happens, right? Even though it's not necessarily ideal. What's up?
So lactic acid is a temporary product?
Temporary product, yeah, and it has to be metabolized away. And if you don't, then you're in big trouble because the more it'll build up, you get something called acidosis. And acidosis is when your blood pH goes down and then all your enzymes don't work and then you just die. Yeah?
So there is basically no other purpose for lactic acid.
Nope. Nope. It's a waste product. Same thing with alcohol. It's a waste product. So interestingly enough, all the beers have roughly... Oh. I'll have to talk about beer tomorrow, I guess.